settle in and let your breathing slow just a little, because tonight, the most dangerous thing in the room is the one you cannot hear. Outside your blanket, imagine cold night air, a concrete power plant, and long hallways lit by small, patient bulbs. Everything hums the way it always does. Vents moving, meters glowing, tired people doing routine work. You might think danger always announces itself. It does not. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary shift with ordinary hands on ordinary doors. And in the Sleepless Scientist corner of the universe, we will take this gently, one quiet step at a time, from warm control rooms to a roof where normal becomes a very thin story. You are walking through a building designed for routine. The floor is hard, the paint is practical, and the lighting is not trying to impress you. It is a place built to do one unromantic thing: make heat, move it into water, and turn that into electricity. That is what a nuclear power station is when it behaves. A very controlled heat machine, like an overqualified kettle that never gets to rest. You can feel the warmth in certain corridors where pipes carry hot water and steam like circulating blood. You can hear the low, steady ventilation, a constant mechanical sigh. You can smell metal that has been warmed for years and cleaning fluid used by people who cannot afford dust. And if you were expecting something exotic, something glowing, something that hisses, you will be disappointed, because the first lesson is this: the dangerous part does not need to look dangerous. It can look like a door. It can look like a clipboard. It can look like a man in tired shoes trying to make it to the end of his shift. The reactor, in the simplest language that still respects the truth, is a place where atoms are persuaded to split. Not violently, not like an explosion, but like a long, controlled tearing. When a heavy atom splits, it releases energy, and it releases neutrons, and those neutrons can split more atoms. If you let that multiplication run wild, you get a very short and very memorable event. If you control it, you get a steady, manageable fire that does not need oxygen. So the core is not a monster. It is a furnace that runs on physics instead of coal. The heat boils water. The steam turns turbines. The turbines spin generators. And the lights stay on in kitchens where nobody thinks about you. That is the deal. Your reward is normal life for someone else. In a control room, that normality is almost a personality. Panels, switches, gouges that twitch a little, the way sleepy eyelids twitch. Small indicator lights, red and green, winking with boring certainty. There is always a hum, because silence would mean something stopped moving, and nothing important is allowed to stop. You might think the real threat would be obvious. A smell, a sound, a wave of heat. But radiation does not arrive like smoke. It does not announce itself like fire. Most of it is not something your body evolved to notice. There is no special nerve ending for ionizing radiation. There is no ancient instinct that whispers, "Step back." Congratulations, you are a primate built for cliffs and fruit, standing near a phenomenon that does not care what you can sense. And here is the quieter part that makes this story so unsettling. Most of the time, the system works. It is designed to be boring. The design goal is monotony. The goal is that people get sleepy around it because the procedures are known. and the numbers stay inside their lanes. The goal is routine until routine becomes the disguise. At Chernobyl, that disguise held right up until it did not. And once the normal story tore open, the problem became something that even professionals struggle to picture. Something invisible, energetic, and persistent. Not a beast with teeth, but a kind of wrongness in the air and on the ground and in the rubble. You move deeper and the building feels like a late-night ship. Metal everywhere. Doors that seal. Passageways that turn. The air handled by ducts and fans. Because humans need it to be handled. People in such places learn to trust their instruments more than their instincts. You do not touch things barehanded if you can help it. You do not stand where you are told not to stand. You do not improvise around a machine that can turn your bones into a slow problem. But tired humans do tired human things. They become casual. They accept the hum as harmless. They assume the walls are thick enough because the walls have always been thick enough. They assume the rules were written by someone smart, and the smart person accounted for everything. Nature loves that assumption, not because nature is cruel, but because nature is indifferent. Indifference is efficient. It does not waste time with malice. So in your mind, keep the scene plain. Keep it disappointingly normal. A corridor, a worker with a badge, a hand on a railing, a light that flickers, not dramatically, but just enough to be annoying. The horror here is not theatrical. It is bureaucratic. And once you have accepted that the most serious threats can be silent, you are ready to step closer toward the roof, where silence turns into urgency. The roof is not supposed to be a mythic location. It is a surface. Tar paper, gravel, patches, seams, the kind of place you would send people to fix a leak or check a vent, a workplace nobody brags about. But tonight, you step out and feel the air bite at any exposed skin, and the roof feels wrong in the way a room feels wrong after a fight. Nothing is moving, yet everything is tense. There are scattered fragments where fragments should not be. Debris that looks like ordinary construction rubble, except it came from the inside of a reactor that was never meant to be open to the sky. Some pieces are twisted metal. Some are graphite, ejected from the core. Graphite is supposed to be inside, where it can do its quiet job of moderating neutrons. It is supposed to be part of the controlled story. Up here, it is a witness, a black, broken witness, and you, unlucky traveler, are here for a simple task. Move it, throw it back, clear it. The kind of labor that does not sound heroic because it is not heroic in its shape. It is heroic only because of what you cannot see. The liquidators were sent up in short shifts because time itself was the enemy, not because the roof was going to collapse beneath you, though that is a reasonable worry. Not because of fire, though there had been fire, but because the dose adds up, quietly, like interest on a debt you did not agree to. Radiation exposure is not always a single dramatic moment. It can be a slow collection of tiny events, a buildup, a tally. Your body is a bookkeeper whether you like it or not. Every ionizing hit is a small act of vandalism against your cells. One hit you may never notice. Many hits close together, and your body begins to notice in the only language it has, symptoms. So, the plan, brutally simple, was to keep each human on the roof for a very short time. A minute? Sometimes less. Not because someone was being theatrical, because even a minute could be too much. And this is where you notice the gear. It is heavy because it has to be. You wear layers not for warmth, but for shielding. Your movement becomes clumsy. Your neck feels trapped. Your breathing feels loud inside your own mask. The suit does not make you feel safer. It makes you feel like a slow animal wrapped in uncomfortable certainty. It is like wearing winter clothes in a sauna. Except the sauna is also trying to rewrite your cells. You take a step and the gravel shifts under your boots. Your balance is awkward. You can hear your own heartbeat and the scrape of your soles. The roof does not roar. The roof does not scream. It just sits there under the night sky, letting physics do what physics does. If you were hoping for a villain, you get rubble, and you begin to understand why machines struggled. It is not that machines are timid. It is that machines have their own limitations. Remote-controlled robots in that era were not prepared for intense radiation. Electronics can fail. Circuits get confused. Insulation breaks down. The invisible problem is not only dangerous to humans, it is also rude to your technology. So, when the machines faltered, the oldest tool in human history stepped forward. A person, 2 arms, a back that can bend, a hand that can grip. There is something almost insulting about that. You build reactors, you split atoms, you create a civilization powered by controlled nuclear reactions. And then, when it goes wrong, the final plan is to send a man with a shovel. Congratulations, you have reached the end of sophistication. So you do the small task. You grab a chunk. You lift. It is heavier than you want, not just in mass, but in meaning. You move it across the roof, and every step feels like it costs you something you cannot measure with your senses. And because you cannot feel it happening, your imagination fills the gap. You picture rays, you picture poison, you picture a glow. But the real thing is smaller, quieter, and more intimate. Radiation does not need to burn your skin in the moment to be dangerous. Sometimes it passes through you like a stranger in a hallway. Sometimes it stops inside you and leaves its energy behind. Sometimes it breaks something tiny, and your body spends the next weeks trying to patch it. Bravery in this setting does not look like shouting. It looks like a person doing a boring job while terrified. It looks like someone going up the stairs because their supervisor told them. It looks like a hand that keeps moving even when the mind is begging it to stop. And then your minute is done. Someone yells. Someone waves. You turn around, clumsy and sweating, and you go back the way you came. Not triumphant, not enlightened, just relieved. And when you step back from the roof and exhale, you start wondering what that invisible thing actually is. So let's make radiation feel less like a monster and more like a strange kind of weather. Radiation at its core is energy traveling. Sometimes it travels like a wave, the way light travels. Sometimes it travels like a tiny piece of matter moving fast. Your body does not care which kind it is if it has enough energy to knock electrons loose inside your cells. That is the defining insult, ionizing. Energy that can break the calm arrangement of atoms in your tissues. Think of it as weather that ignores your skin. If you stand in sunlight too long, you can get sunburned. You might not feel it while it happens. You feel it later when the damage has already been done and your body is reacting. Radiation can be like that, except you cannot squint and you cannot step into shade that you can see. Or think of wind. Most of the time, you only notice wind when it pushes something you care about. It rattles a window. It dries your eyes. It makes a tree sway. The wind was there before you noticed it. Radiation is like that too, except the tree is your DNA, and the sway is a miscopied instruction. And there is an important distinction that humans had to learn. Fast. Being near a source is not the same as being contaminated. Being near a source is like sitting near a campfire. The heat is there. Step away, and you are cooler. Put a wall between you and it, and you are cooler. Distance helps. Shielding helps. Time helps. Contamination is like walking through smoke and ash and then bringing that smell into your home. It clings. It rides on your clothes. It settles in your hair. You can leave the campfire, but it came with you anyway. On the roof, there is both. There is a place that is emitting radiation, and there is also radioactive dust and fragments ready to hitch a ride on anything that touches them. And that second part is what makes it feel so personal. The danger is not only over there, it can become on you. So safety becomes a simple set of habits, repeated until they are muscle memory. Stand farther away when you can. Even a few steps matter, because radiation spreads out through space. The closer you are, the more of it reaches you. Step back, and the intensity drops. Not politely, not gradually, but decisively. Like a speaker that suddenly gets quieter when you leave the room. Put dense material between you and the source when you can. Thick concrete, metal, water. The universe respects mass. It does not like to push energy through dense obstacles without paying a price. And keep your time short, because dose is a relationship between intensity and duration. A short time in a high field can be worse than a long time in a low field. The arithmetic is simple, even if the consequences are not. But the most unsettling part is what that energy does when it reaches you. Your body is made of instructions, not in a poetic way, but in a chemical way. Cells carry DNA, and DNA is a long molecule that stores information. It tells your cells how to make proteins, and proteins do everything. They build, they repair, they sense, they move. They keep the lights on inside you without asking permission. Radiation can smudge those instructions. Sometimes the smudge is repaired because your cells have repair systems. They are not helpless. They are not passive victims. They are busy little mechanics, constantly checking for mistakes. They do this even on a normal day, because normal life is not gentle either. Sunlight, chemicals, random errors when copying DNA. The world is always scraping you a little. Radiation is simply a harsher scrape, a deeper gouge, and sometimes the smudge is not repaired correctly, or it is repaired in a way that changes the meaning. Most of the time, that changed meaning does nothing. Sometimes it kills the cell, which is unpleasant but contained. Sometimes it changes a cell in a way that makes it replicate when it should not. That is where cancers can begin, not as a curse, but as a bureaucratic error in a molecular office. But acute exposure, the kind you worry about on a reactor roof, can overwhelm repair faster than it can work. Then the damage is not subtle. Then systems begin to fail together because too many cells are injured in the same hour. Speaking of delicate instructions, the next place to visit is inside you, where cells quietly try to repair the daily mess of being alive. Imagine your body as a night shift factory, not a shining science fiction factory, all chrome and perfect timing, more like an old industrial place that somehow keeps running because the workers never stop. Inside you, there are teams. Some cells are copying DNA slowly and carefully because copying is dangerous. It is like rewriting a fragile book by hand while someone shakes the desk. Every time a cell divides, it risks mistakes. So it has proofreaders. It has checkpoints. It has little routines that pause the process and ask, "Are we sure?" Other cells are cleaning up, sweeping out damaged components, breaking down proteins that have worn out, replacing membranes, managing salt and water and sugar, keeping the internal pressure right so you do not swell or shrivel. Your immune system patrols like a bored security guard with occasional moments of terror. Most nights, it finds nothing. Sometimes it finds a virus, and then the whole building goes into emergency mode. And even on a calm day, damage is happening. Oxygen, the thing you depend on, is also reactive. The chemistry that keeps you alive also creates byproducts that can harm you. Life is a compromise with a universe that prefers simple, stable molecules. You are not simple. You are not stable. You are maintained. So when radiation arrives, it is not introducing the concept of damage. It is increasing the workload. It is like a sudden surge of paperwork dropped on the night shift. Too many errors to fix, too many breaks in too many places, and the body responds the way a system responds when it is stressed. It sends alarms. Nausea is one of those alarms. Not because your stomach is the target, but because your body is trying to manage a crisis with limited tools. Fatigue is another. A deep heaviness that feels like the power has been turned down. Skin irritation can happen because skin cells divide often, and fast-dividing cells are more vulnerable when the blueprint is being copied and repaired under stress. Think of dose as how much trouble your repair crew has to handle. A low dose is a few extra tasks, annoying but manageable. A high dose is an impossible night. Phones ringing, machines failing, supervisors shouting, the floor flooded, and everyone trying to do 3 jobs at once. And the sad fairness is this: your body tries its best, even when it cannot win. There is no moral scorekeeper. Cells do not survive because you are a good person. Repair systems do not work harder because you have dreams. Biology is generous in effort and indifferent in outcome. It is beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, consistent, physical, and uninterested in your story. So when people talk about radiation sickness, it can sound like a single thing. But it is really the body losing the ability to keep up with itself. It is maintenance delayed, then skipped, then abandoned. It is the factory running without enough staff until the lights flicker. And because bodies cannot see what is happening, humans learn to listen to something else. Machines that can hear what we cannot. You will hear it before you understand it. A clicking. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady little chatter like an insect in a jar. The Geiger counter is one of those devices that feels like it belongs in a ghost story because it turns something invisible into sound. It does not measure fear. It does not measure evil. It counts events. Each click is a little interaction, a particle or ray dumping energy into the detector, like raindrops on a roof. One drop is nothing. A million drops becomes a storm. The clicking can be slow and almost comforting, like a metronome, or it can speed up into something frantic, like a panicked typewriter. In places like Chernobyl, those clicks became a language, a way to translate the invisible into decisions, where you can stand, how long you can stay, which path through a corridor is safer, not because it looks safer, but because the numbers whisper that it is. People drew maps. They marked zones. They made a new kind of weather forecast, not for clouds, but for contamination. This patch is hot. That corner is worse. This stairwell is acceptable for a short time if you do not touch the railing. And there is a small comfort in that, even now, listening in bed. Measuring something scary makes it a little less magical and a little more manageable. Not safe, not fine, but knowable. The clicking is not reassurance, it is information. And information is sometimes the closest thing to mercy that physics allows. And once you can measure an invisible danger, the next question is what to do with a place that stays dangerous. So, let's talk about the long, slow job of cleaning. Cleaning starts the way all human solutions start, with someone realizing the problem will not politely vanish overnight. You are standing near a building that has become a kind of unwanted campfire, except the heat is invisible and the ash is microscopic. The first impulse is dramatic, of course. Bulldoze it, wash it, burn it, blow it up again, but correctly this time. But radiation is not impressed by impulse. It is impressed by distance, mass, and time, and it makes you do paperwork. So the cleaning becomes housekeeping. Slow, procedural, tiring housekeeping, the kind where your reward is not a shiny floor, but a slightly lower number on a meter. You learn quickly that contamination behaves like glitter at a children's party. It gets everywhere. It sticks to boots. It hides in cracks. It clings to fabric. It rides air currents like it paid for a ticket. If you touch one surface, then touch a door handle. Congratulations, you just invented a new contaminated surface. The roof debris was the obvious mess, but the invisible mess is worse. Dust, fine particles, a powder you cannot see unless light hits it just right. And your lungs are not picky. Your skin is not perfectly sealed. Your equipment has seams, your gloves crease, your mask shifts when you speak. So you do what humans always do with a mess they cannot fully remove. You try to control where it goes. You start with simple acts that feel insultingly ordinary. Sweeping, but with rules. Hosing, but carefully. Scrubbing, but only in areas where scrubbing will not grind contamination deeper into pores and cracks. You wipe down smooth surfaces because smooth surfaces do not hold on as fiercely. You avoid rough concrete when you can because concrete is a sponge made of stone. Sometimes you remove soil. Literally, You peel away the top layer of earth and put it somewhere else, because the top layer is where the fallout settled. You treat the land like a stained carpet, and the solution is to cut out the stained section. It is not elegant. It is not spiritual. It is labor and trucks. You might assume the goal is to make everything clean again. That is a comforting fantasy. The real goal is triage, reduce exposure, stop spread, make pathways that are less dangerous than the ones beside them. In some areas, they used chemicals that would bind dust, making it heavier, less likely to lift into the air. Fixatives, sticky coatings. The same idea as spraying hairspray on a fragile craft project, except the craft project is a disaster site and the glitter wants to live in your marrow. In other areas, the solution was to bury. Soil on soil, concrete on rubble, paint on walls. You do not defeat the contamination so much as you persuade it to stay put. And that is how you start to think about the biggest act of cleaning at Chernobyl. Not washing, not sweeping, not removing, covering. The reactor building, open to the sky, is not simply a broken machine. It is an ongoing source. It continues to emit. It continues to shed. It continues to exist stubbornly as a place where the normal world is being converted into a long-term problem. So the plan becomes, build a lid. The first shelter, what people later called the sarcophagus, was assembled under intense conditions. It was construction work in a field of invisible needles, cranes lifting heavy parts, concrete poured in awkward places, workers taking short shifts, rotating like tired gears, because even construction becomes a race when the air itself is charging you rent. You can imagine the scene from above, a gray industrial landscape, dust, heat rising from machinery, the slow ballet of cranes, and underneath it all, the quiet arithmetic of dose. Every bolt tightened is also a small trade. A little more time here, a little less time later. The structure was never meant to be pretty. It was meant to reduce release, to trap dust, to stop rainwater from carrying contamination outward, to make the worst part less available to the wind. Wind is a particular enemy here because wind does not care about borders or warning signs. Wind does not respect your cleanup schedule. If loose contamination can be picked up, it will be picked up. It will move like a rumor. So you seal cracks. You cover broken surfaces. You keep wetting down certain areas so dust stays heavy. It is a strange reversal. Water, which usually spreads problems, is used to pin the problem down, at least for a while. But even water has a darker side. Rain falls, snow melts, water flows, and when water flows through contaminated debris, it can carry dissolved and suspended particles with it. Then you have to think about groundwater, about runoff, about where puddles form, about where that puddle drains. Congratulations, you are now managing an ecosystem of mistakes. So cleanup becomes a combination of methods, none of them perfect. Remove the worst pieces when you can. Cover what you cannot. Isolate areas with fences and signs. Restrict access. Control dust. Monitor everything. And monitoring is not a side task. It is the entire backbone of this work. You take measurements constantly because contamination is patchy. One spot can be relatively calm and the next can spike sharply because a small fragment landed there or water carried something and deposited it. the landscape becomes a checkerboard of invisible risk. It teaches you a harsh lesson about intuition. Your eyes cannot grade this hazard. Your instincts are not calibrated for it. The most dangerous patch might look like the safest one, because it is just a clean-looking square of concrete with a story inside it. So people used maps like weather reports, hot spots marked, routes planned, work scheduled, equipment staged, and those maps had to be updated because contamination moves, dust drifts, materials are handled, rain falls, snow plows push slush, tires roll through mud. Even the act of cleaning can spread contamination if it is done carelessly. A brush can lift dust, a hose can splash, a truck can carry soil out on its treads, a worker can bring it home on clothing if procedures fail. That is why decontamination includes the unglamorous ritual at the boundary between hot and cold areas. You step through checkpoints. You remove outer layers. You bag and label. You wash hands and boots. You measure again. If the numbers do not behave, you do not argue. You go back and try again. In a place like this, cleanliness is not a smell. It is a measurement. And as you watch all this, you begin to understand the psychological weight of it. The work is repetitive. It is slow. It has no triumphant finish line. It is not like putting out a fire where the flames stop. It is more like managing mold in an old house. You can reduce it, you can contain it, but you learn that the building has changed, and you will be dealing with it for a long time. This is where the human mind starts reaching for drama to make sense of it. Heroes, villains, clean endings. But the reality is closer to municipal maintenance, a long-term infrastructure problem with an invisible irritant built into the pavement. And yet, some problems do demand big gestures, because even with cleaning, even with maps and short shifts and layers of rules, the reactor remains a source, a persistent pile of materials that are not done being unstable, a place where radioactive elements are still decaying, still emitting energy, still doing what physics told them to do. So you cover it and you keep watching it. And over the years, you discover something both comforting and unsettling. The danger changes on its own. Some of it fades quickly. Some of it hangs around with the patience of stone. And that brings you to the strange medicine of time, which is also, of course, a threat. Half-life is one of those terms that sounds gentle, like a quiet reduction, like a dimmer switch, but it is not a decision. It is not mercy. It is a clock built into unstable nuclei. Imagine you have a room full of tiny ticking devices. You cannot hear them, but you know what they do. At random moments, each one will click, and when it does, it will throw a little energy into the room. You cannot predict which one clicks next, but you can predict the statistics of the crowd. A half-life is the time it takes for half of those devices, on average, to click and transform into something else. After one half-life, you have half as many of the original troublemakers. After two half-lives, you have half of that half. It keeps going, not to zero, but toward it, slowly, in fractions. It is a calming concept at bedtime, in a grim way, because it means intensity tends to drop. But it is also maddening, because it means there is no single moment where you can point and say, now it is safe. It is more like a smell in fabric. It fades, it lingers. Some parts clear quickly, other parts hold on for seasons. Different materials have wildly different half-lives. Some isotopes flare hot and then vanish quickly, like a brief tantrum. Others simmer for decades. That means the character of the hazard changes with time. In the first days and weeks after an accident, there can be isotopes that dominate because they are intensely radioactive, but short-lived. They make the early period especially dangerous. They are loud, in the language of Geiger clicks, but they do not last long. Then, as those burn out, longer-lived isotopes become the main story. The overall intensity can decrease, but the persistence, the danger becomes less like a fire and more like an unpaid mortgage. One of the names that tends to surface in these discussions is iodine-131. It has a half-life of about 8 days. That means it decays fairly quickly, which sounds nice until you remember what it does while it is present. Iodine is something your thyroid gland actively collects because your body uses iodine to make hormones. Your thyroid is efficient. It does not know the difference between stable iodine and radioactive iodine. It just sees iodine and reaches for it like a hungry hand. So, in the days after a release, radioactive iodine is an outsized concern, not because it lasts forever, but because your body is built to concentrate it in one small, sensitive place. A tiny biological funnel. This is why you hear about potassium iodide tablets in nuclear emergency plans. It is not an antidote to radiation. It is not a magic shield. It is a simple trick. Flood the thyroid with stable iodine so it is too full to take up much radioactive iodine. You give the gland what it wants so it stops grabbing what you fear. It is clever and it is limited, and it only matters for that specific kind of isotope. It is not a universal solution. The universe does not do universal solutions. Then there are isotopes like cesium-137. It has a half-life of around 30 years. 30 years is long enough to outlast careers, governments, and the patience of anyone assigned to a cleanup budget. Cesium behaves chemically a bit like potassium, and potassium is everywhere in biology. Nerves use it. Cells maintain gradients of it. Your body is full of systems that move potassium around all day, so cesium can spread through ecosystems in ways that feel unfairly efficient. It can be taken up by plants, eaten by animals, concentrated in certain foods. It can become a slow traveler through forests and fields. Strontium-90 is another one people mention, with a half-life of about 29 years. Strontium behaves chemically like calcium. And calcium, of course, is how you build bones. That means strontium can find its way into skeletal tissue. Again, the insult is not just the radiation. It is the biological habit that escorts it into the places you least want it to settle. And then, deeper in the debris, you have isotopes and elements with half-lives that stretch much longer. Some forms of plutonium, for example, can have half-lives measured in thousands of years. That does not mean they are the main driver of external dose everywhere, but it does mean the story does not end neatly within a human lifetime. It is difficult to hold that timescale in your mind without feeling a little strange. You, a creature that measures life in decades, are dealing with materials that will remain active across the rise and fall of languages, the same way ancient ruins outlasted the people who built them. Some radioactive contaminants outlast the institutions that tried to contain them. So time becomes both comfort and burden. Comfort, because radiation intensity can decrease. Burden, because the persistence requires cooperation from the future. You fence areas and put up signs as if you are speaking to people not yet born. You are asking them politely to respect a boundary they did not choose. And the signs themselves become a kind of philosophical joke, a symbol meant to warn primates, a shape and color system designed for human eyes. Meanwhile, the atoms underneath do not read. They do not care. They decay in the dark with the same calm rhythm, whether anyone remembers them or not. You might think, at this point, that the place becomes increasingly empty, that the only presence is warning tape and wind. But while humans are very good at leaving, life is very good at returning. Because the moment you remove constant human pressure, the ordinary pressure of roads and noise and farming and hunting, the ecosystem starts to rearrange itself. The exclusion zone becomes quiet in a way that is almost theatrical. Roads with weeds pushing through cracks, buildings with broken windows breathing cold air in and out, trees leaning into abandoned structures like curious guests. And you, moving through it in your mind, can hear that different kind of sound. Not the industrial hum of a plant, the soft noise of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant calls of birds that do not care what a reactor used to be. It is tempting to narrate this as nature healing. That is the story people like. It has a clean arc. Humans make a mistake, humans leave. Nature forgives. But forgiveness is a human concept. What you actually see is replacement. Animals return because the biggest predator left. Not the wolf, not the lynx, the one that builds highways. Deer and boar move through the trees. Wolves roam territories with fewer interruptions. Birds nest in structures that used to hold machinery. Beavers take over waterways and change landscapes with the casual authority of animals that never read environmental impact reports. The absence of people removes one kind of mortality. Fewer cars, less hunting, less habitat destruction. That can allow populations to grow even in a place with contamination. This is the part that makes the zone feel like a paradox. It can be both a refuge and a hazard, a place where life is abundant and also subtly burdened. Because contamination is not uniform. The zone is patchwork. Some areas have higher levels, some are lower. Some hotspots are small, sharp, and unexpected, like a forgotten ember in ash. So a fox might den in a relatively calm area, but hunt across a more contaminated field. A bird might feed in one place and roost in another. A wild boar might root around in soil that holds cesium, then wander into a cleaner patch of forest. And the effects are not always obvious. This is not a cartoon where animals glow. The reality is gentler and more complicated, which is somehow worse. Radiation at low to moderate levels can increase mutation rates. It can stress organisms. It can affect reproduction. It can cause subtle shifts in health. But ecosystems have many pressures already. Parasites, weather, food availability, competition. The challenge, scientifically, is to separate radiation effects from the noise of normal life. Researchers have studied populations in and around the zone looking at things like DNA damage markers, reproductive success, and physical abnormalities. Some studies report increased rates of issues in certain species and areas. Others emphasize that the absence of humans has allowed many animals to thrive overall. Both can be true at the same time, because thriving is not the same as being untouched. The zone is not Eden. It is not a wasteland. It is a place where the rules shifted and life adapted in the way life always adapts, by continuing. Plants do something especially interesting here, because plants are stuck. Animals can leave a bad patch. Plants live where the seed lands, so plants become long-term witnesses to local conditions. Forests take over open spaces. Moss grows on concrete. Roots crack foundations. Microbes in soil continue their invisible work, breaking down organic matter, cycling nutrients, performing the quiet chemistry that makes land usable for the next generation of growth. And microbes, in particular, are good at being indifferent. They do not have nervous systems to panic. They do not have a narrative. They simply reproduce and die and reproduce again. If radiation kills many of them, the survivors fill the gap. Selection is not moral. It is arithmetic. That does not mean radiation is harmless. It means the biosphere is persistent. Even in humans, you see a strange mirror of this persistence. Workers and scientists still enter the zone for maintenance and monitoring. People still visit, sometimes as tourists, moving along approved routes. The place is managed, not erased. Over time, the original sarcophagus itself aged. It was not meant as a forever structure. Weather worked on it. Corrosion, stress, settling, the quiet violence of seasons. So later came a larger structure, the newer safe confinement, designed to cover and contain more securely, and to allow eventual dismantling work under controlled conditions. It is another reminder that cleanup is not a single event. It is a relationship. It is long-term stewardship of a problem you inherited from one bad night. And while you walk these empty streets in your imagination, there is a creeping realization that feels almost personal. This disaster was not made of one decision. It was made of many small ones, small misunderstandings, small pressures, procedures bent, assumptions trusted, systems that worked until they did not. That is why it is such a potent story, not because it is unique, but because it is a concentrated version of how humans interact with risk. In your daily life, you also live inside systems you do not fully see. Electrical grids, food supply chains, water treatment, medicine manufacturing, aviation, building codes. Most days, they hum along like the ventilation in that control room. You do not notice them. That is the point. And when they fail, you are reminded that normal is not a guarantee. It is an achievement, maintained by tired people and checklists and maintenance schedules and budget meetings that nobody wants to attend. Liquidators, in that sense, were not mythic beings. They were people with backs that hurt, and faces that sweated inside masks, and thoughts that kept circling back to family and to the simple desire to go home. They were doing a job under conditions that made the job feel like punishment. They climbed stairs, they carried things, they followed orders. They tried not to touch their face. They tried not to fall. They tried not to think too hard about the invisible arithmetic happening inside their bones And there is a quiet lesson there that does not need hero worship. When you cannot remove a danger, you manage it. When you cannot see it, you measure it. When you cannot measure it perfectly, you build rules that assume you are dumber and more tired than you want to admit. Distance, time, shielding, hygiene, rotation, monitoring, records. Records are their own kind of comfort. Clipboards and logs and dose badges, all of them a way to say, this happened, and we will remember it in numbers if memory fails. A personal dosimeter, worn on the body, becomes a small private historian. It does not care how brave you feel. It reports what you received. It can be checked later when someone decides whether you go back out or whether you have had enough. And the tragedy of extreme exposure is that sometimes the badge is almost redundant. The body becomes the record. Skin reddens. Nausea arrives. Fatigue deepens. Fever. The immune system falters because the bone marrow, one of the busiest cell factories in the body, is especially vulnerable. Blood cell production suffers. Infections become more likely. Wounds heal poorly. The body that usually repairs itself becomes a body struggling to keep up. That is acute radiation syndrome. When the dose is high enough, fast enough, over enough of the body. It is not one symptom, it is a cascade. And then there is the long tail, the increased risk of cancers years later, the difficulty of proving cause in a world where people get sick for many reasons, the unsettling feeling of carrying a probability instead of a certainty. That probability is the currency of radiation risk. It is not cinematic. It is statistical. It turns health into an actuarial table, which is a very boring way to describe suffering, and therefore a very human way to try. This is part of why the whole subject feels like cosmic horror in a lab coat. The threat is invisible, the mechanism is indifferent, and the outcome is often delayed. But humans are not powerless in the face of it. They just have to be annoyingly disciplined. They have to treat the invisible like it is real, even when the room looks normal. You see this discipline in modern radiation work, in hospitals where radiation is used for imaging and therapy, in industry where radioactive sources are used for measurement, in research labs, in nuclear plants that run for years without incident because systems are built with layers of safety and culture is built around not improvising near invisible hazards. The lesson is not that nuclear physics is evil. The lesson is that complexity demands humility. A reactor is a controlled heat machine, yes, but it is also a machine that punishes misunderstanding. It punishes shortcuts. It punishes poor communication. It punishes complacency. Not out of spite, out of physics. And now, if you let your mind wander a little wider, you can see Chernobyl as part of a larger pattern. Humans learning, slowly, that risk is not eliminated by confidence. Risk is reduced by boring habits repeated consistently, and those habits show up everywhere. Seatbelts, sterile technique, fire codes, food temperature rules, airplane checklists that are read aloud even when the pilots could recite them from memory. You might roll your eyes at that kind of procedure in normal life. It feels fussy. It feels slow. It feels like bureaucracy. But bureaucracy is sometimes just fear that learned to type. And speaking of fear that learned to type, there is something almost soothing about the way all of this returns to the same few ideas: distance, time, shielding, measurement, repair. Because those ideas do not only apply to radiation, they apply to many invisible forces you live with: pathogens, toxins, heat, cold, even gravity, that quiet tyrant you never get to negotiate with. In a sense, your whole life is built on managing invisible dangers through boring routines: washing hands, cooking food, locking doors, looking both ways, charging your devices so you can call for help when the universe gets creative. Tonight, though, you are not on a roof. You are not wearing a heavy suit. You are not listening to a Geiger counter click faster. You are in the aftermath, looking at how a place is managed over time and how life reshapes itself around absence. And the more you look, the more you notice a final, quietly unsettling detail. Even the concept of the zone is a human boundary, a line on a map, a radius measured from a point. But contamination does not spread as a perfect circle. It spreads with wind and rain and terrain. It creates tongues and patches and streaks. So, the zone is a compromise between the messiness of nature and the neatness of administration. It is, like everything else here, an attempt to make the universe fit into a form you can manage. And you can manage it to a degree. You can reduce exposures. You can keep people away from the worst areas. You can contain debris. You can monitor food and water. You can learn which mushrooms and berries tend to concentrate cesium. You can advise hunters where not to hunt. You can test milk for iodine in the early days. You can build systems that keep the risk lower than it would be without attention. But the risk never becomes a story you finish reading and put back on the shelf. It becomes a story you maintain, which is why time matters so much. Not as a romantic idea, but as a physical process. As years pass, some isotopes decay away into stability. The loud early hazards diminish. The long-lived ones remain, quieter but stubborn. The overall field shifts. The hotspots cool. Slowly, the maps change. The procedures adapt. And in that long time scale, human memory becomes one of the most fragile components, because the half-life of institutional knowledge can be depressingly short. A few retirements, a few budget cuts, a few political cycles, and suddenly the boring habits that kept people safe start to fray. So, the job is not only to contain the reactor, it is also to contain forgetting. That is why the signs matter. That is why the records matter. That is why training matters. That is why a new generation of engineers and technicians has to learn the old lessons without paying the full price again. It is a strange inheritance, a place fenced off not because of monsters, but because of atoms doing what atoms do. A place that asks future humans to be patient, disciplined, and humble. And while the zone stays quiet, with trees leaning through windows and animals crossing empty roads, you can feel the broader thought forming. Disasters do not usually feel like disasters while they are being built. They feel like normal work. They feel like routine. They feel like a night shift that wants to end. And risk, most of the time, is not faced by heroes. It is faced by tired people with checklists, which brings you gently, inevitably, to the soft lessons hiding under all this grit. Not moral lessons, not inspirational posters, just observations about work, systems, and the way you live inside hazards you rarely notice. Because somewhere far from that reactor roof, you also trust invisible systems. You trust that your water is safe. You trust that your food will not poison you. You trust that your building will not collapse while you sleep. You trust that the air in your room contains enough oxygen and not too much smoke and not too many things your lungs were never designed to filter. Most nights, that trust is rewarded. The world stays boring. But boring is maintained. Boring is the product of constant quiet repair, performed by people and institutions, and also, inside you, by cells that never sleep. And speaking of that internal night shift, there is an odd comfort in remembering that your body is already practiced at dealing with damage. Not just radiation damage, but the ordinary damage of life. Small errors, small breaks, small stresses. Your DNA is copied and checked. Proteins are replaced. Cells are removed and renewed. The immune system patrols. The brain consolidates memories and clears metabolic waste. You are, even now, a bundle of maintenance routines wrapped in a warm narrative. The difference, of course, is scale. On the roof, the damage arrives too fast, too intense, too dense for repair to keep up. In normal life, the damage is slower and the repair wins more often. That is one of the few advantages of being far from a reactor accident. Your repair crew has manageable workload. The night shift is busy, but it is not on fire. And yet, the mind likes to borrow fear from distant places. It likes to imagine worst cases. It likes to run simulations because the brain is a prediction machine that cannot always tell the difference between useful planning and late-night doom. So it helps to remember the practical truth underneath the story. Distance works, time works, shielding works, measurement works, procedure works, within limits. These are not poetic ideas. They are physical ones. They are the boring tools that kept countless workers alive long enough to go home, eat dinner, and fall asleep with a faint, metallic taste of anxiety fading from their mouths. And while you sit with that thought, there is another quiet thread you can tug on. Something that connects Chernobyl not only to modern safety culture, but to how humans respond when the world becomes suddenly, technically, dangerous. Because radiation is only one kind of invisible threat. There are other forces that do not announce themselves. Carbon monoxide that steals oxygen from your blood without a smell. Viruses that replicate in your throat before you feel a fever. Fine particulate pollution that inflames lungs over years. Even the slow pull of gravity on bones and muscles, changing bodies over decades with no sound at all. The universe is full of silent processes. Some of them keep you alive. Some of them wear you down. Most of them do not care whether you notice. And if you can learn to live with that, without panic, you start to see risk differently. Not as a monster hiding in the dark, but as an ordinary feature of reality that requires ordinary care, which is, in its own bleak way, a gentle idea. Because ordinary care is something humans can do. Not perfectly. Not always, but often enough to keep the lights on and the roofs intact. And as the thought settles, you may find yourself wondering about the most patient part of this whole story. The way radiation changes, not because anyone fought it, but because time itself keeps taking pieces away, decay by decay, half-life by half-life, until what was sharp becomes duller. Not gone, just reduced. And that slow reduction has its own strange rhythm, like a clock you cannot hear, counting down in a language older than alarms. And if you lean closer to that unheard clock, you start to notice something else about it. It does not only count down, it also changes the kind of danger you are dealing with. In the early days after a release, the problem behaves like a loud storm. Not loud to your ears, but loud to your instruments. Short-lived isotopes throw energy around with enthusiasm, then burn through their own instability quickly. Later, the storm quiets, but it refuses to leave. It becomes drizzle that lasts for decades. You stop running from the sky, and you start managing your roof. That is why time is never purely comforting in a place like this. You do not get a clean redemption arc. You get a slow shift from urgent to chronic, from crisis management to land management, from firefighting to gardening with gloves you do not trust. And you, because you are you, start thinking like a planner. You stop asking, when will it be safe? You start asking, safe for what and for whom? Because the universe loves context. It hides inside it. A level of contamination that is tolerable for a short visit is not tolerable for a child living there full time. A soil concentration that is acceptable for a paved road is not acceptable for a vegetable garden. A forest that is fine to walk through is not fine to forage in. If the mushrooms have been quietly collecting cesium like they are paid by the gram, so the zone becomes a place of rules. Not because rules defeat atoms, but because rules shape human behavior. And human behavior is the one variable you can still edit. You put fences where you can. You post signs where you think they will survive. You restrict farming. You watch the rivers. You monitor the milk. You sample the meat of hunted animals outside the zone. Because animals do not understand that borders are serious. And this is one of the strangest parts. The way contamination turns ordinary things into complicated things. Grass becomes a transport system. Fungi become chemical collectors. Bones become storage. Dust becomes a messenger. A simple gust of wind becomes a delivery service. You used to think of weather as clouds and rain and temperature. Now you think of weather as whatever moves particles from one place to another. Wind direction becomes a piece of policy. Mud becomes a reason to wash a tire. A dry season becomes an anxiety. Congratulations! You have become the kind of person who stares at soil. And still, even with all that careful attention, you cannot seal the entire world. You can only make the problem smaller and slower and less likely to surprise you. So let your mind walk through the long maintenance years, not the dramatic night of the accident, the unromantic years after, when the disaster becomes a budget line and a job description. You are a technician now, or a surveyor, or an engineer who draws lines on maps. You wear practical clothes. Your tools are not heroic. A sampler, a meter, a clipboard, maybe a handheld detector that chirps or clicks or shows a number that tries to be calm. You take readings, then take them again. You label bags. You log locations. You compare to last month, to last year. You watch patterns. You learn that contamination does not just sit there like spilled paint. It migrates. It sticks to organic matter. It binds to clay. It gets taken up by roots, then shed in leaves, then returned to soil, It moves through food webs in small, persistent transfers. In some places, it goes deeper over time. In other places, it stays near the surface. Forests can hold on to cesium in their litter layer, that soft mattress of leaves and needles that keeps recycling itself. Fires can re-release it because burning does not destroy atoms. Burning simply lifts them back into the air on a column of hot smoke. Even the act of nature returning has sharp edges. A thriving forest is beautiful. A thriving forest is also fuel. A dry summer comes, and lightning finds a tree, and now you have a radioactive campfire that can send particles drifting, not a dramatic plume that circles the planet. More like a quiet reminder that the zone is not frozen in time. It is alive. It keeps doing things. So you watch the forests. You cut fire breaks. You plan for smoke. You treat a normal ecological process like a hazard scenario. And in that slow vigilance, you begin to understand something that is almost too mundane to be called wisdom. Most disasters do not end. They just become routine. That is why the big engineering solution, the idea of covering and containing, matters so much. You cannot mop up a reactor core like a spilled drink. You can only isolate it, then build an entire culture around not poking it. The early shelter at Chernobyl did a brutal job, under brutal conditions. It reduced releases. It trapped debris. It bought time, but it was never a final answer. It was a bandage on a wound that does not clot quickly. So later came the new confinement structure, bigger, stronger, designed to last longer, designed to allow work under it. It is a massive arch, slid into place over the old shelter, like someone carefully placing a glass dome over a broken insect collection. It is a human move, not to erase the past, but to put a lid on it and admit you will be dealing with it for generations. Inside that confinement, future work is planned like surgery. You do not send people into the hottest spaces if you can avoid it. You use remote equipment. You monitor the air. You filter. You keep track of dust like it is a contagious disease, because in a way, it is. This is the future of managing radioactive environments. Fewer heroic minutes on roofs, more robotic arms and cameras, less throwing debris with shovels, more careful cutting and packaging. Still, the core lesson stays the same. The threat is not cinematic, it is administrative. The danger is managed by controlling pathways. Pathways of air, pathways of water, pathways of food, pathways of people. And speaking of pathways, if you want to understand why radiation is so unsettling, you do not have to stare at a reactor. You can stare at the way your own body is built, because your body is fundamentally a pathway machine. Air goes in and out. Food goes in and out. Blood moves through vessels. Cells divide. Proteins get made, used, recycled. Your whole existence depends on movement through channels. Radiation is dangerous, partly because it can interrupt those channels at the smallest level. It can damage cells that line your gut, which is why nausea and diarrhea can show up in high exposures. It can damage cells in your bone marrow, which is why blood cell counts drop. It can damage the skin, which is why burns can appear without heat. And it does this by being a very specific kind of rude. Ionizing radiation knocks electrons loose, That creates ions, charged atoms or molecules that behave badly in polite biological chemistry. It can directly break DNA strands, or it can create reactive molecules, like free radicals, that then attack DNA and membranes. That is the real mechanism under the ghost story clicking. You are not being haunted. You are being chemically vandalized. And your body, that night shift factory, responds with a mixture of competence and limitation. DNA repair is impressive. It is also not magic. Cells can stitch breaks. They can replace missing bases. They can pause division. They can trigger self-destruction. If damage is too severe, that self-destruction is called apoptosis. It sounds dramatic, but it is basically a cell choosing to die neatly instead of living dangerously. Apoptosis is a quiet hero in your body. It prevents damaged cells from becoming worse problems. But apoptosis has a cost. If too many cells die at once, tissue stops functioning. Your gut lining can slough off. Your immune system can collapse. Your skin can lose its barrier. So, in acute radiation syndrome, the body is caught between two bad options: keep damaged cells and risk chaos, or kill damaged cells and lose essential functions. You do not want to be in that negotiation. And that is why the Liquidators were timed. It was not theatrics. It was crude protection of that repair balance. Keep exposure low enough that repair and replacement stay ahead of collapse. Dose, in that sense, is not a moral number. It is a workload number. And when the workload is too high, you see the phases that doctors learn to recognize. There can be an early phase with nausea and vomiting because the body reacts quickly to severe cellular stress. Then sometimes there is a deceptive lull, a latent period, where someone seems to improve. The body looks like it is recovering. People relax. But underneath, the cell populations that renew tissues are depleted. The gut cannot replace itself fast enough. The bone marrow cannot replenish blood cells. Infections and bleeding become more likely. The crisis returns, not as one dramatic moment, but as a system failure that unfolds across days and weeks. It is one of the crueler features of biology, the way you can feel better shortly before you feel much worse. And even when someone survives the acute phase, there are longer-term risks that linger like paperwork that never closes. Increased cancer risk, cataracts, cardiovascular effects in some contexts, depending on dose and distribution. Not guaranteed outcomes, but altered probabilities. You carry a quiet shift in odds. Now, set that biology down gently for a moment, like a heavy tool you do not want to drop. Because the story is not only about what radiation does to you, it is also about what humans do when confronted with something like this. Humans do not do well with invisible gradients. You want simple categories: safe, unsafe, clean, dirty, here, there, done. Radiation offers you none of that. It offers you maps that change. It offers you hot spots that hide. It offers you a threat that does not announce itself and does not end with a single victory. So humans respond in a very specific way. You build rituals. You build the ritual of measurement, the ritual of protective clothing, the ritual of stepping through checkpoints, the ritual of washing and rewashing, the ritual of record keeping. These rituals are not superstition. They are behavior scaffolding. They are how you force yourself to respect something you cannot feel. And the people who do this work, the ones who keep showing up, are rarely in a heroic mood. They are tired. They are paid. They complain. They drink tea. They get headaches. They count days until vacation. They argue about equipment. They fill out forms. That is how most of reality is survived, not with speeches, but with routines. You can see this in the way radiation safety is taught. It is not a thriller. It is a 3-word mantra dressed up in training modules. Time, distance, shielding. Minimize time near sources. Maximize distance. Use appropriate shielding. Prevent contamination spread. Monitor dose. Use dosimeters. Follow procedures. It is boring on purpose. It has to be boring because in a crisis, boring instructions are the ones you can still follow. The most dangerous thing you can do around invisible hazards is improvise with confidence. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because it applies far beyond radiation. It applies to chemical plants, to aviation, to infection control, to any domain where failure is rare but catastrophic. Which brings you back to the human side of Chernobyl, the fact that it was not just physics. It was human systems interacting with physics. Design decisions, training, communication, culture, incentives. The way authority works in a room at night. The way fatigue changes judgment. The way people follow the mood of a team. The way you can talk yourself into believing a number is fine because you want it to be fine. The reactor did not explode because the universe had a bad day. The universe was doing what it always does. Humans were the ones building a story around it until the story broke. And this is where, in your mind, you might return briefly to that roof again. Not to repeat it, but to understand it differently now. You are not there as a symbol. You are there as a worker in a system that ran out of options. Robots failed because electronics do not like intense radiation. Heavy machinery struggled because debris was awkward and access was limited. Time was critical because the longer debris stayed exposed, the more contamination spread, and the harder it became to build containment. So you used humans because humans are adaptable and cheap. In the bleak accounting of emergency response, humans can climb stairs. Humans can make quick decisions. Humans can grab irregular shapes. Humans can tolerate heat and discomfort and fear up to a point. That point is measured in minutes. There is something almost brutally honest about that. The most advanced energy technology meets the oldest labor model, and yet there is also a kind of competence in it, a grim competence. People did go up. People did move debris. People did reduce exposures for others later. The work mattered, not because it redeemed anyone, because it reduced the spread of a physical hazard. That is how you have to think if you want to stay sane around disasters, not in terms of purity or blame or heroic narratives, in terms of consequence management. What action reduces harm? And that is exactly what decontamination and containment are. Not cleansing, but harm reduction. Take away the hot spots you can, seal what you cannot, keep dust down, filter air, control water, restrict access, monitor food. Then do it again and again and again. Now, while this long maintenance happens, time keeps doing its quiet work. But it does not work equally on all sources. Some materials decay quickly, others persist. and the environment itself decides how that persistence feels. Cesium can bind to soil particles, especially clays, making it less available in some contexts, more available in others. Strontium can move with groundwater more readily in certain conditions. Different landscapes produce different behaviors. Wetlands, forests, sandy soils, agricultural fields, all with different chemistry. So the same isotope can be a different kind of problem in different places. This is why environmental monitoring is not a one-time survey. It is ongoing science. You collect samples over years. You compare. You model transport. You adjust rules about what can be eaten and where. And here is a small, oddly intimate detail about how scientists do this. Sometimes you measure a mushroom. You walk into a forest that looks normal, quiet, green. You pick a mushroom that looks harmless, maybe even beautiful. You bring it back to a lab. You put it near a detector, and you listen in numbers to a story the forest has been telling silently for decades. Some fungi are particularly good at concentrating cesium. That means they can show higher activity than the surrounding plants. Then an animal eats those fungi. Then a human eats that animal, if hunting is allowed. So risk is not only about standing near a reactor, it is about participating in a web of transfers. Radiation turns ecology into accounting. And speaking of accounting, the units humans use for radiation are their own strange language. You will hear words like gray and sievert in technical contexts. A gray is about absorbed energy per mass, how much energy gets dumped into tissue. A sievert is about biological effect, a weighted unit that tries to capture how different types of radiation and different tissues produce different harm. But you do not need to memorize those words tonight. The important part is simpler. There is energy deposited, and there is biological consequence. Not all radiation is equally damaging per unit energy. Alpha particles, for example, are heavy and highly ionizing. They do a lot of damage over a short distance. Outside the body, alphas are often stopped by skin or even paper. Inside the body, if an alpha emitter is inhaled or ingested, it can be far more dangerous because it deposits that damage directly in living tissue. Beta particles, lighter and more penetrating than alphas, can travel farther. Gamma rays, like high-energy light, can pass through the body more easily, requiring denser shielding. So, the form of radiation matters. The route of exposure matters. Inhalation, ingestion, external exposure, contamination on skin, each with different practical hazards. This is why workers worry so much about dust. Dust is not dramatic. Dust, pathway. If radioactive material stays outside you, you can often shield it, distance from it, clean it off. If it gets inside you, you cannot step away from your own organs. You cannot put a concrete wall between your thyroid and iodine that your thyroid already absorbed. You become the container. So, decontamination procedures focus on keeping material out of lungs and mouths. Masks, filters, controlled areas. No eating or drinking in contaminated zones. Careful removal of clothing to avoid resuspending particles. Washing. It is all very ordinary and very strict. Now, if you let your mind drift back out into the exclusion zone again, you can see how this strictness changes human presence there. People who work in the zone do not treat it like a wilderness hike. They treat it like a workplace with invisible irritants. There are designated routes, places you do not step, areas you do not touch, time limits, checkpoints, monitoring stations. Visitors sometimes think of it as eerie tourism. Workers think of it as Tuesday. And that contrast between a place being both haunted in popular imagination and mundane in daily operation is part of the zone's strange atmosphere. The world loves to mythologize danger. The people managing it are busy making sure dust stays on the ground. But nature is also busy, and nature does not read signs. You can stand near an abandoned apartment block. The windows are dark. The concrete is stained. A tree grows from the balcony like it got tired of waiting for permission. Birds nest in the corners. Insects live in cracks. You might think radiation would stop this, but most of the zone does not have uniformly lethal levels. Life continues because life can tolerate a lot, and because the absence of humans removes many other pressures. Still, when scientists look closely, they sometimes find changes that are easy to miss if you only look for dramatic mutations. Subtle differences in reproductive success, changes in population structure, increased DNA damage markers in certain hotspots, differences in microbial communities in soil, not always consistent across studies because ecosystems are noisy and hard to control, but enough to remind you that persistence is not the same as innocence. The zone is not a clean experiment. It is a messy landscape where multiple variables collide. And there is another factor that complicates everything: the way humans themselves interact with the zone's edges. People live outside the zone. They farm, they gather firewood, they fish, they hunt, they pick berries and mushrooms. Some of those activities are regulated. Some happen anyway, because humans, like all animals, pursue food and habit and tradition. So radiation risk becomes partly a social problem. Education, trust, economic necessity, cultural practices. It is hard to tell someone not to collect mushrooms if collecting mushrooms is how they feed their family and maintain their identity. This is where risk management stops being a physics problem and becomes a human problem. Not because physics changed, but because decisions determine exposure. The same contamination field produces different health outcomes depending on behavior, and behavior is shaped by poverty, information, and belief. That is why the soft lessons of this story are not only about shielding, they are also about humility in policy, about communicating uncertainty, about supporting people so they can make safer choices. Because telling someone do not eat that is easier than ensuring they have something else to eat. Now, while all this unfolds over years, the scientists keep listening to the land. They use gamma spectrometry to identify isotopes by their energy signatures. They drill cores to see how contamination moves through soil layers. They track radionuclides in water systems. They monitor plants and animals. They build models that predict how activity will decline and redistribute, and slowly, a picture forms of a landscape that is neither dead nor healed. A landscape that is altered. Altered landscapes are common on Earth. Cities are altered landscapes. Farms are altered landscapes. This one is just altered in a way that makes humans nervous, because the alteration is invisible and tied to sickness. But from the planet's perspective, It is just another patch of ground with a particular chemistry, which is a bleak thing to say, but it is also clarifying. The earth does not mourn your mistakes. It grows over them. And in that growing, there is a second kind of time at work. Not radioactive decay, but ecological succession, the gradual replacement of plant communities as years pass. Grass gives way to shrubs. Shrubs give way to young trees. Young trees become forest. Dead wood accumulates. Soil changes. Animal communities shift. You can see it in abandoned villages. A garden becomes a thicket. A road becomes a narrow path. A schoolyard becomes a meadow. The lines humans drew get softened by roots and frost and rain. So even as the radiological hazard slowly diminishes, the physical landscape becomes less human. The zone becomes harder to navigate, not because of radiation, but because of vegetation. Nature does not clean up after you. It redecorates. And this is the part where your mind, being an existentially curious creature, starts to connect it back to your own life again. Because you also live inside systems of slow change. Your body changes slowly, cell by cell. Your habits change slowly. Your home gathers dust slowly. Your relationships drift slowly. You do not notice most of it because you live at the speed of days, not the speed of decades. Radiation, in the long term, is one more example of slow consequence. Something that can be intense and immediate, yes, but also something that can persist quietly, requiring attention long after the headlines leave. And that should feel familiar, because much of modern life is like that. Climate change is like that, though driven by different physics. Microplastics are like that. Air pollution is like that. Chronic stress is like that. Things that accumulate, then express themselves later. The universe seems to enjoy delayed feedback. So if you take one practical comfort from this, it is that humans have developed ways to handle delayed feedback. You measure, you track, you set standards, you build institutions, you argue about numbers, you improve instruments, you adjust behavior. You do not eliminate the hazard. You reduce exposure. That is what civilization is, in many ways. A long campaign of harm reduction against indifferent physics. Now, back in the zone, there is a detail worth lingering on, because it is quietly sinister in its simplicity. The most dangerous things in a contaminated environment are often the things that look like souvenirs. A small fragment of graphite that looks like a black rock, a piece of metal that looks like scrap, a shiny object half buried in dust, a discarded glove, a bit of debris someone could pick up without thinking. Humans like to pick things up. You are a tool using primate with curious hands. That curiosity is usually useful. Here, it is a liability. So safety culture includes learning to keep your hands to yourself. It is a skill. A child learns it in a museum. A worker learns it in a hot zone. Look, do not touch. And when you do have to touch, touch with barriers, gloves, tools, procedures, bags, labels. Because contamination is not like a predator you can see and avoid. It is like paint that never dries. It transfers easily. It punishes casual contact. That is why, in cleanup, packaging becomes a central activity. Not dramatic removal, but careful containment. You put contaminated material into drums. You seal it. You store it. You track it. You turn a scattered hazard into an inventory. And that inventory is then managed across years, stored in facilities, protected from weather, monitored for leaks, guarded from theft, because radioactive sources have security implications too. Yes, even in the middle of a tragedy, you have to worry about someone stealing the dangerous thing for their own plans. Humans are impressively consistent that way. So the aftermath of a reactor accident includes not only environmental science and health monitoring, but also security and logistics and engineering. It is a full-spectrum human project. Now, if you slide your attention back to the Liquidators again, you can see how all these later systems grew out of the desperate early work. The roof work was triage, the building of the shelter was triage, the evacuations were triage, the early decontamination was triage. Later, the zone management is the chronic care plan, and the people involved change too. In the beginning, you had soldiers, firefighters, plant workers, miners, construction crews, medical staff. Later, you have researchers, engineers, inspectors, maintenance teams. Different uniforms, same underlying physics, and through it all, you have the instruments, the quiet translators between the invisible world and the human one. Dosimeters, worn on the body, logging exposure over shifts, survey meters scanning surfaces, air samplers pulling particles through filters, lab detectors analyzing samples, satellites and aerial surveys mapping radiation fields from above, because sometimes the safest way to measure a place is not to stand in it. Measurement becomes the sense organ humanity did not evolve with. And there is something almost tender about that. We were born without the ability to feel certain dangers, so we built a prosthetic sense. We built a way to hear the rain on the roof, even when the roof looks dry. Of course, prosthetic senses have limitations. In the early chaos after accidents, instruments can saturate, max out, or give confusing readings. Some early responders at Chernobyl struggled with meters that were not designed for the levels present. A meter can tell you high without telling you how high. That is like a thermometer that only says hot. And if you trust that limitation, you can make very bad decisions. You might think it is only at the top of the scale, when in reality, it is far beyond it. So part of the lesson is not only measure, but measure with the right tool. Again, very boring, very important. Now, let the story widen a little, away from one site toward a general truth about radiation and work. There are places in the world where people work with radiation safely every day. Hospitals use it for diagnosis and therapy. Industry uses it for inspecting welds and measuring thickness. Research uses it for tracing pathways and studying materials. Most of those workers do not feel like they are flirting with cosmic horror. They feel like they are doing a job, because in controlled settings, the rules work. Sources are sealed, time is limited, distance is planned, shielding is designed, contamination is prevented, dose is tracked, standards are enforced, training is repeated. The hazard becomes manageable as long as the culture stays intact. The problem at Chernobyl was not that radiation exists. The problem was uncontrolled release combined with human factors. So if you ever wonder why safety culture can feel so rigid, so stubborn, so allergic to improvisation, it is because the hazard does not forgive improvisation. A mistake around radiation is not always immediately obvious. That is what makes it dangerous. With fire, you feel heat and see flames. With sharp objects, you see edges. With heights, you feel fear. With radiation, you can feel nothing at first, then pay later. That delay is why humans need external discipline. And that brings us gently into the last and widest part of this journey. The soft lessons about risk, work, and the strange privilege of being able to fall asleep far from the places where physics is loud. You can think of liquidators as a category of person, but in reality, you are looking at ordinary human variation. Some were volunteers, some were conscripts, some were skilled specialists, some were simply assigned. Many were young, many were tired, many were working with partial information, because disasters rarely provide complete clarity. In the fog of crisis, you make decisions with what you have. And what you have is often a supervisor, a procedure, and a clock. You might like to imagine you would refuse, that you would be the principled one, stepping back, demanding better protection, asking for better data. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it does not. Human beings are social animals. In a crisis, you look around to see what others are doing. You follow the group. You respond to authority. You respond to urgency. And if you are exhausted, you become more compliant, not because you are weak, but because fatigue narrows the mind. Fatigue is its own invisible hazard. It makes checklists harder to follow. It makes you skip steps. It makes you accept uncertainty because arguing takes energy. So when you look at a disaster response, you should also look for the sleep debt behind it. The long shifts, the stress, the cognitive overload. Nature does not care if you are tired, but being tired changes what you do. This is why high reliability industries obsess over rest and shift management. Why aviation has duty time rules. Why medical residencies, though still brutal in many places, have been forced to confront fatigue. Why nuclear plants have strict operational procedures and staffing requirements. Because fatigue is a predictable failure mode. And the older you get, the funnier and sadder this becomes. Humans can design complex systems, but you still have to run them with primate brains that want naps and snacks. Congratulations! The weak link is always the mammal. So one soft lesson is simply that safety is not only about technology, it is about respecting human limits. Another soft lesson is about the way big disasters are made of small pieces. Rarely is there one villain lever pulled for no reason. More often, there are misunderstandings that stack, assumptions that go unchallenged, communication gaps, a culture that discourages speaking up, a schedule pressure, a test performed at the wrong time, a parameter misread, a safety system disabled because it is inconvenient. Then physics arrives, and it does not negotiate. So if you want to learn from such events, you do not only study the explosion, you study the meeting rooms, the shift handovers, the training materials, the incentives, the language used to describe risk. Because disasters are social events with physical consequences. And when you bring that back to everyday life, it becomes less about nuclear reactors and more about the quiet systems around you. The water in your pipes is safe because someone maintains a treatment plant, follows procedures, tests samples, and fixes failures. The food in your store is safe because there are standards, inspections, cold chains, hygiene routines, and a whole network of people doing boring things correctly. Your building is standing because codes exist, engineers follow them, inspectors inspect, and materials are rated. Most of the safety you enjoy is not a miracle. It is a long history of mistakes turned into rules. Rules are fossils of disasters. That is not a poetic metaphor. It is practically true. Somewhere, sometime, something went wrong, and the response was to write it down so it would not happen again, or at least so it would happen less. And if that sounds cynical, good. Cynicism, when paired with competence, is basically how civilization keeps functioning. Optimism builds projects. Cynicism builds guardrails. Now, there is a quiet emotional twist in this story that is easy to miss. When you talk about liquidators, you are often pulled toward drama, toward sacrifice, toward moral grandeur. But the lived experience was often something smaller. Fear, yes, but also boredom, waiting, confusion, physical discomfort, paperwork, standing in lines, being told to go here, then being told to go somewhere else. Risk is often administered, not confronted. And that is why it is so easy in normal life to forget how much of your safety depends on administration. A checklist does not feel heroic. It feels annoying. It feels like someone does not trust you. It feels slow. But checklists are how you protect yourself from your own confidence. They are how you make sure tired brains do not skip steps. So the next time you feel irritated by some small safety ritual in life, like a confirmation screen, a lockout procedure, a warning label, a redundant step, you can remember that these rituals are built for the nights when things are not normal. They are built for fatigue. They are built for distraction. They are built for the human tendency to believe everything is fine until it is not. And speaking of believing everything is fine, there is another invisible process happening right now. Even as you lie there listening, your body is still doing its quiet repair. Cells are replacing old proteins. Your immune system is sorting signals. Your brain is managing chemistry. Your bones are slowly remodeling. Your gut lining is renewing. The night shift continues, not because you asked it to, but because you are a maintained creature. This is relevant because one of the most unsettling things about radiation is that it attacks that maintenance. It turns repair into triage. It turns renewal into shortage. So there is a strange comfort in knowing that, in your current environment, the maintenance systems are operating within normal conditions. The world around you is not demanding emergency mode. Your risk tonight is likely not acute radiation. It is more mundane, a stiff neck, a dry room, a small anxiety, the ordinary hazards of being human in a modern space. And modern hazards have their own invisible enemies. Carbon monoxide, for example, is a gas you cannot smell. It binds to hemoglobin in your blood more strongly than oxygen does, reducing your ability to carry oxygen. It can make you sleepy, confused, then worse, without feeling like an attack. It is one reason detectors exist in homes. A detector is a kind of domestic Geiger counter. It turns invisible risk into sound. Mold spores, too small to see, can irritate lungs over time. Fine particulates from pollution can inflame airways. Viruses can spread before symptoms show, so you already live in a world where the most serious threats are sometimes silent, and the response is often measurement and procedure. Wash hands, ventilate, use detectors, follow food safety habits, get vaccinations, maintain equipment, do not run a car in a closed garage, do not ignore strange smells, do not dismiss headaches in groups. Boring. Again. Good. And if you zoom out far enough, the whole human project looks like this. A species building prosthetic senses and behavioral rituals to survive environments it was not designed for. Radiation is just a particularly honest example because it refuses to be moralized. It does not punish sin, it punishes proximity and time. So the soft lesson is not be afraid. The soft lesson is be precise. Be precise about what the hazard is. Be precise about what reduces it. Be precise about what you can control. Distance, time, shielding, contamination control, measurement, procedure, and one more that is easy to forget, communication. Because the half-life of information is often shorter than the half-life of the hazard. People retire, people move, records get lost, institutions change, budgets shrink, priorities shift, the story fades, the fence rusts, the sign falls. The next generation wonders why that patch of land is empty. So the real long-term containment is not only concrete and steel, it is cultural memory. You can build a structure to last a century, but can you build an instruction to last a century? Can you build a warning that makes sense to someone who does not speak your language, does not share your symbols, does not care about your history? That is a strange design problem, almost philosophical, almost like you are trying to communicate with the future the way you would communicate with aliens. This is why radioactive waste management includes conversations about markers, monuments, and messaging. How do you tell the distant future, do not dig here? How do you convey danger without relying on current cultural context? Because if your warning looks like a temple, someone might explore it. If it looks like a treasure vault, someone might open it. If it looks boring, someone might ignore it. Congratulations, you are trying to outsmart curiosity. And the reason this matters is that Chernobyl is not the only site where long-lived materials exist. It is just the most famous. Nuclear technology produces waste, and waste is an obligation across time. So, the Chernobyl story is also a preview of humanity's relationship with its own long-term leftovers, not only from reactors, but from industry in general. Chemical contamination, heavy metals, plastics, greenhouse gases. We keep inventing materials and processes that outlast our attention spans. So we have to invent institutions that last longer than a news cycle. Now, to keep this grounded, return for a moment to the simplest human scale again. Imagine you are a worker entering a controlled area in the zone for a routine maintenance task. You check in, you receive a dosimeter, maybe two, one for real-time alarms, one for record. You put on protective clothing, you tape seams, you check your mask fit, you review the route, you know where you can stand and where you cannot. You know what surfaces are likely contaminated. You walk in and everything looks normal. Concrete, metal, trees, a road. But the normality is a trick of your senses. The real map is in your instruments. You do the work quickly, but carefully. You avoid unnecessary contact. You keep track of your time because time is dose. You avoid sitting on the ground. You avoid touching your face. You keep tools contained. Then you leave and you go through the exit protocol. You remove outer layers carefully, turning them inside out, containing contamination. You wash. You survey yourself with a handheld meter. You check your boots. You check your gloves. You check again. If you are clear, you step out. If not, you repeat. It is like leaving a messy workshop, except the mess is invisible and potentially inside your pores. This is what professional caution looks like. Not fear, not bravado, just respect for the hazard. And that respect, if you carry it into everyday life, becomes something gentler. You do not have to be anxious all the time. You just have to be realistic about what you can sense and what you cannot. The human senses are wonderful. They are also limited. You cannot smell carbon monoxide. You cannot see ultraviolet light. You cannot feel a slow rise in blood pressure. You cannot detect radiation. So you build detectors. You build tests. You build rules. That is how you make the world livable. And this is where the title of tonight's story stops being only about Chernobyl. It becomes about you, living inside invisible systems, relying on invisible work, maintained by boring procedures. You do not last a day on that roof, not because you are weak, but because your body is not designed for that environment. None are. Humans survive there only by rationing exposure and rotating workers. They survive by limiting time and using shielding and measuring constantly. They survive by acknowledging limits. And acknowledging limits is, ironically, one of the most powerful things a person can do. Because the opposite, pretending limits do not exist, is how you end up on a roof with a shovel. Now, while you let that settle, there is still another thread worth following, because it ties together the zone, the body, and the larger universe. It is the thread of indifference. Radiation is indifferent. Ecology is indifferent. Time is indifferent. Your cells are indifferent. They do not hate you. They do not love you. They perform chemistry. They follow rules. That can feel cold, but it can also feel stabilizing, because it means you can learn the rules. You can learn how contamination moves. You can learn how repair works. You can learn how to protect workers. You can learn how to design safer systems. You can learn how to avoid repeating failures. The universe is not trying to trick you. It is just complicated. And if you have to pick one attitude that helps in complicated worlds, it is not optimism and it is not despair. It is careful attention, so you keep your attention on the quiet details, on the boring tools, on the slow changes. You think about how a fence line is maintained, how often signs are replaced, how monitoring stations are calibrated, how filters are changed, how workers are trained, how shift rotations are scheduled, how waste is transported and stored. This is the actual texture of managing a disaster site decades later. Not drama, not constant fear. A lot of maintenance. And maintenance is a kind of love, even if nobody wants to call it that. It is choosing to keep harm reduced. It is choosing to prevent spread. It is choosing to respect the future. Now, Speaking of the future and the way we communicate across time, you can start to feel the story tugging toward other invisible forces that also shape your life without asking. Gravity, for one, is always there, always pulling, never loud, never negotiable. It is the original silent threat and silent caretaker. It holds your blood in your legs, it shapes your bones. It keeps the atmosphere on the planet. It also ensures that if you trip, the floor will win. Time, too, is always doing its work, not just on atoms, but on structures, memories, institutions, and bodies. And as you keep following that thought, you can begin to sense how the same boring principles show up again, in different costumes, measuring what you cannot sense, respecting limits, building procedures, designing around human weakness, and letting time do what it does while you try to steer outcomes. Because there is always something else invisible